reptilian shapeshifters are behind ISIS, the Federal Reserve and Sesame Street. This is the False Flag Nation podcast.
Alright, and welcome back to another episode of False Flag Nation, the podcast where we delve into conspiracy theories, the occult, and all things esoteric. This is your host, Joe DeMarco. Joining me, as always, is my co-host, Mr. William Revere. Can you hear me, Will?
Loud and clear, loud and clear. And I have a new mic here, so
Yep.
I'm excited to test this out today.
You do sound a little clearer than normal, so this is good. We may stick with this from now on.
All right, perfect.
But we've got a pretty intense podcast ahead of us here. We're going to be dealing with all the World War III rumors that have been circulating over the internet for the last 3 or 4 weeks. This has been going on for a while, but it really seems to have hit kind of a fever pitch this month, February 2016. So we're going to be deconstructing the 3 major theaters where this seems to be unfolding in Ukraine, in Syria, and in the South China Sea, as well as examining some of the more hidden aspects of this and what are the underlying motives for the events you see unfolding on the news. But before we dive into that, we got just a couple quick news items to go through, and then we'll jump into the meat and potatoes of this. But
yeah, we ought to touch on the election and on the Republican side specifically. So we've had a couple events that have taken place since our last podcast, especially with our boy Jeb.
Yes.
It seems like his days were numbered, but he has officially suspended his campaign.
Yes, after the South Carolina primary last week, our dear amigo Jeb Bush has suspended his campaign. I could tell, I was watching this live, and I could tell just from the tone of when he was speaking that he's throwing in the towel. I know, and the Koch brothers super PAC establishment must be fuming right now, knowing that they dropped $130 million on his campaign,
God.
and he didn't win a single state. I don't think he was even in the top 3.
Right.
In any of the states that have had caucuses or primary caucusi, would that be plural? But his campaign was an absolute disaster. So he dropped out, and then more recently, we had the debate a couple nights ago, Thursday the 25th, where it seems like the Koch brothers knew. The great white hope for the establishment, Marco Rubio, had a software upgrade because he did pretty well.
Right, he seemed to have swift comebacks to everything that was coming at him. So
yep, the Marco Soft was upgraded to 2.0 and included detailed knowledge of past legal dealings, including the Trump University, which apparently is a fake school. It just scammed people. They were charging like $35,000 for tuition to learn real estate stuff, and apparently it's like a non-accredited university. It's basically like a really expensive version of University of Phoenix with the Donald Trump name on it. So,
right.
He slung all kinds of mud at him, and we'll see if it pays off because the Super Tuesday elections our primaries are in 2 days, so we'll see if any of the costly software investment on the part of the super PACs paid off.
Now, do we think that after Jeb dropping out, do we think that the establishment will be choosing Rubio as their presidential hopeful.
Yeah, well, that's what I've been saying. They seem to be putting all their efforts behind Rubio because they don't like Ted Cruz. We've discussed that before,
Right.
and it seems our dear old friend Krispy Kreme is having none of that because he came out the day after the debate on Friday and endorsed Donald Trump.
Wow.
And no, I don't think anybody saw that coming, but we know that he does not like Rubio. He's the one that caused all those system failures in MarcoBot over the last debate. We was calling him out. We saw him sweating profusely. There's little puddles of it all over, and Donald Trump was commenting on those puddles. It's like, you should have seen him. It's like he was standing in a mud puddle. He starts spraying water on the audience with his water bottle and then throws the bottle off the stage. It's like Stone Cold Steve Austin with his cans of beer.
You got to admit, he's got charisma, he's got style, so I think he's fascinating. I think he's interesting, but he's also dangerous.
I would agree for the most part. I think he's definitely tapped into the feelings of frustration that the political and economic establishment, and a lot of those grievances are legitimate. And I think we're going to have to do an episode just about why Trump and to a lesser extent Sanders have gained the kind of momentum they have, because that relates to a lot of really what this podcast is about.
That would definitely be a good one, because although they're on polar opposite sides, they're still gaining popularity because they're honing in on their party's aggravation towards the status quo. So
absolutely. We will definitely be doing a show about that soon. But are there any other items in the news you wanted to explore a bit, or do you want to just jump right into this?
I think for time purposes, we ought to jump right into this. This is a huge topic, and it's incredibly detailed. So we're going to try and hit, like you said previously, the three major campaigns where World War III could erupt. But this is something that we're going to be revisiting in the False Flag Nation future. So without further ado, I think we ought to jump into this.
Yeah, agreed. And you said start in the future. I would make the argument that in some ways it's already begun. And it's a conflict that's being waged not just militarily, but economically and politically as well. There's that old expression by Karl von Clausewitz, war is diplomacy by other means, and the opposite is true as well. It's war and diplomacy are two sides of the same coin. Right. And then you have the economic aspect of this whole thing you see going on in Ukraine, in Syria, and in the South China Sea. And those are the three major theaters we just referred to, where it seems like this, thing that these seemingly unrelated phenomena that are unfolding in the news that could spark a global conflict and are interconnected in ways that are not readily apparent on the surface. But I think the best place to start here, Will, would be the Ukraine conflict, because that was the first one that really sparked.
Right, and that's just an interesting situation for many reasons. Over the past year and a half or so, there's been a lot of media attention to President Obama's reaction to the Ukraine situation involving Russia, obviously. And there's been a lot of attention on how President Obama has not stood up to Vladimir Putin in more ways than he should have. So the media is already painting this as the West and the U.S. versus Russia, where the U.S. Really doesn't need to be involved in this conflict in the Ukraine.
Yeah, it's the underlying thing here is that this, on the surface level, this appears to be kind of like an ethnic nationalist conflict, because as people who've been following this know, the Ukraine is kind of the border between Russia and Europe. That's literally
Right.
what the name Ukraine means in the Ukrainian language. It's the borderland, and in eastern Ukraine, most of those people are actually ethnic Russians, including on the Crimea Peninsula. And in western Ukraine, they're ethnic Ukrainians, and they speak the Ukrainian language. Now those throughout most of the 2000s, Ukraine seemed to be kind of drifting towards joining the European Union after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And they were going to more closely align their politics and their particularly their energy policy with the European Union.
Right.
And the reason for that is Europe is really dependent on Russian natural gas. There's pipelines. Russia is sitting on massive natural gas deposits in Central Asia, and they pipe that gas into Western Europe, and that's what provides most of Western Europe's energy. But Ukraine discovered that there were massive natural gas deposits in Western Ukraine, like closer to Europe than Russia, obviously. So this opened the possibility that they could just cut Russia out of the equation and start getting their gas from that region instead of being dependent on Vladimir Putin's government.
Okay, so you have an attempt at a closer relationship between European powers and the Ukraine, but Russia basically saying no, you're not going to cut us off. You're a great customer for us, and basically our economy runs off of money generated from our natural resources. So this would be a huge problem for the Russian people.
Yeah, well, the thing is, as I said earlier, a lot of Ukraine is actually ethnically Russian, and they identify more with the Russian culture, and they sympathize more with the Russian government as well, particularly people in the Crimean Peninsula. And there was an election back in 2006, I believe. And guys, but people who are listening, apologies if we get some of the details of this wrong. It's like with regards to like dates and things like that. This is extremely complicated. And this is kind of an introduction to what the larger phenomenon that's unfolding here. So if there's smaller details we don't get 100% correct, just try to bear with us here. There's tons of videos about Ukraine.
Right, I'm sure we'll be flooded with internet trolls trying to discredit us.
Yeah, that's clearly wrong. It was elected in 2005. Baffling. There was an election in 2006, according to my notes here, and the president of Ukraine announced that they would be reversing course and pursuing closer ties with Russia. And this promoted mass protests, and the opposition party took power as a result of those protests. It was in something called the Orange Revolution in 2006, and that guy Pomoshenko, I believe is his name, is still in charge of Ukraine right now. Now him taking power and sort of shifting back to the European side of things provoked the Russian population in Ukraine. So a referendum was held in Crimea, and they voted to become part of Russia. So Russia sent troops in to occupy the peninsula, and it annexed Crimea, and that's now part of Russia right now. It's the little piece of Ukraine that juts out onto the Black Sea, if you're looking at the map.
Right. Yep.
And then this could have ended right there, but the problem is rebel groups of ethnic Russians started fighting against the central government in Kiev, and they apparently were receiving arms and weapons from the arms and supplies from the Russian government. Even though Putin denies this, there's Apparently, there's video of them sending trucks over the border. The Russians are claiming the videos are faked. It's hard, and that this is Western propaganda,
Right.
because they're siding with the Ukrainian government. Both sides are claiming the other is at fault, and then
So you have Russia trying to arm and fund a coup, if you will.
pretty much, yeah. This appears to be a proxy war between Russia and NATO, if you believe how this is being presented on the mainstream media. And in 2014, a commercial jet from the Netherlands was shot down in Ukraine. It killed like 300 people, and it was blamed on the Russian opposition, the Russian-backed opposition in eastern Ukraine.
Right.
And they're claiming it was an accident, but this happened, and that led to a fresh round of sanctions against Russia, because the U.S. government and NATO, or Western European governments, are insisting that Russia is responsible for this, because they're trying to undermine the Ukrainian government to keep Western Europe dependent on their natural gas, because this Russian company Gazprom, this is energy company, has a monopoly on natural gas in Europe.
So that's interesting. I mean, for people who don't know the situation, especially resource situation in Europe, what is it? Mostly Germany, Poland, France, Spain, upwards into Spain and Portugal are all receiving natural gas and oil, and I think it's somewhere in the 30% or above.
From what I looked at, it was around 25 to 30%.
Okay, but they're basically dependent on Russia for their way of life
to a large extent. Yeah,
I mean, how do you even begin to comprehend that? I mean, wouldn't Russia want to have a better relationship with Western countries if they're looking for customers from them? And don't you think that maybe a more diplomatic approach in the Ukraine situation would stand to result in better economic policy for all of the countries involved?
Well, no, the Russians saw this whole thing with exploiting the natural gas deposits in Western Ukraine as an act of hostility against them. This was an attempt to cut them out of the equation and cut off a major source of revenue for Russia, because these fields were going to be exploited by Western companies like Chevron and ExxonMobil, and things like who are from France and the United States and things like that. And they saw this as a geopolitical maneuver to kind of cut Russia out of the equation and rob them of revenue. And plus, it would give them another country that they could insert troops in. Because if you look at where NATO troops are stationed, they're in the Baltic countries, Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, and then Ukraine as well. So and then Finland and Norway. So from the Russian perspective, this looks like a NATO attempt to encircle them and cut them out of the world economy, and to just contain them and keep them in this weakened state that you saw, like when in the 90s when Boris Yeltsin, that fat drunk, was in charge of Russia.
Right.
So they interpreted this as an act of hostility, and they responded in kind and have begun aggressively asserting influence in Ukraine. So the sources I've uncovered seem to be indicating that in response to that, there was the desire by Western countries and NATO to build a pipeline from the Middle East from like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Syria, and Turkey, and then pipe gas into Europe through that route.
Okay, so that would further isolate Russia from this situation.
Yes, that would be a way of bypassing this whole situation. Sending gas through.
Now that gets a little bit interesting too, and it kind of leads us into the second theater that we're talking about.
Exactly.
How does that potential pipeline relate to what's happening in Syria and ISIS?
Because apparently this pipeline was supposed to go through Syria, and Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, refused. He wouldn't allow it to be built through Syria. And then, what a coincidence, suddenly this uprising occurs in Syria aimed at overthrowing the government. Now, this is tied
which was
into...
funded by the U.S.
Well, we're getting to that. This is tied into the larger phenomenon of the Arab Spring, where you had these revolts against these old school, like, strongman Arab dictators like Hosni Mubarak and Muammar Gaddafi. And then in Syria, you had the Assad family, which had been ruling that country for a long time. Unlike the other countries, Assad fought back and was winning for a long time. And then these rebels asked for help in the form of airstrikes and supplies, and the United States and Arab countries began providing it. And then suddenly, around the same time, ISIS emerges on the scene. The U.S. insists that this group started in Iraq and then crossed the border into Syria, where there was already this civil war happening, and it was able to gain strength from there, and there it expanded into Iraq. That may be true.
Right. A lot of the hawks in the Republican Party blame Obama's and pulling troops out of Iraq too early.
Yeah.
For what happened in the creation of ISIS, which is just not true, because ISIS was a result of the U.S.'s involvement in Iraq, period. So,
well, they kind of have an argument in the sense that if they had stayed in Iraq, they would not have been able to expand into Iraq, but they would have been in Syria as well. So ISIS would just still exist, but not control as much territory. Again, this is buying the more conventional explanation about what ISIS is. If you look into the more esoteric ones, ISIS was created by Western intelligence, the theory goes, to overthrow the Assad regime so that a central bank could be installed, similar to the Federal Reserve System or the Bank of England, because Syria is one of the few countries, if you look this up, that does not have a central bank system. Their government issues their own currency. And so it seems like there's two motives for getting rid of Assad. One is to build this pipeline, and then the other is to install this central bank that they didn't have, and then to open the Syrian market up to foreign investment from international corporations, because previously they weren't allowed in there. It seems like there's a lot of different motives, but those seem to be the two big ones.
Right, so you have the kind of conspiracy theory type who are blaming this, on the New World Order and their desires for the destruction of a gold-backed currency and a sovereign nation in the Middle East, like Syria, which is not directly connected to any other Western countries, which is a threat to any sovereign nation is a threat to the New World Order. So,
sure.
There's no doubt that there were horrible things that were done by the Syrian government to the Syrian people, but there's also a lot of evidence that Syria was a relatively stable and economically healthy country for a good part of its existence. So, it's a double-edged sword, I guess.
Yeah, that's the thing about this is that there's really no. This isn't one of those situations where there's a good guy and a bad guy. It's just it's a whole bunch of bad guys with very questionable motives.
Right.
All taking each other on, and this just orgy of violence there. And then everything we just described is taking place within the backdrop of this larger sort of Cold War between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Right.
And there's a religious divide here as well, because Saudi Arabia is seen as kind of the leader of the Sunni Muslim world, which is the majority of Muslims, and then Iran is a predominantly Shiite country. And if you look at the distribution of Sunnis and Shias, most of Iran is Shia, most of Iraq is Shia, and most of Syria and Lebanon is Shia as well. So there's kind of a Shia axis stretching from Iran all the way to the Mediterranean, and then the Sunni axis is south of that, with part of Iraq, all the Gulf states, and then you get into Egypt and North Africa as well. So,
and you have the historic partnership with the United States and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
So you have this, basically the U.S. Is controlling Saudi Arabian foreign policy via oil contracts and etc.
Well, it's a little more complicated than that. And this kind of dovetails into the third theater as well, because the U.S. dollar system right now is called the petrodollar system.
Right.
That was set up in the 30s or the 70s after the U.S. got rid of the gold standard. And this was basically an agreement with the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, since they were the largest producer of oil, that they would sell oil only in U.S. dollars. So as long as that continued, that was the basis of the U.S. dollar's power. That's why the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency. When a country's currency fails, it can adopt the U.S. dollar as its currency. If you go to Panama or Ecuador, they use the U.S. dollar as their currency there.
Wow.
And a variety of African countries as well.
So that's one of the reasons why the economic doomsdayers like Peter Schiff and others are constantly saying, and rightfully so, that the nail in the coffin of the U.S. economy will be the rejection of the petrodollar and
exactly.
A switch to either a Chinese currency, gold, or some sort of Russian currency to trade oil in.
Exactly, and this is like the larger backdrop. This is the sort of thread that runs through all these three threads here, all these three theaters of conflict. Because for decades, the U.S. and Saudi Arabia have had this arrangement, and more in recent years, people have been kind of scratching their heads. Why is the U.S. so buddy with Saudi Arabia? Most of the 9/11 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. Most of Saudi Arabia is the one funding these madrasas, these Islamic schools throughout the Muslim world that are preaching Wahhabism, this form of Sunni fundamentalism that extremist groups like ISIS ascribe to. So the thing is that this arrangement benefits the U.S., but it gives Saudi Arabia leverage to do these shady things, and the U.S. can't really stop them.
Right.
Because Saudi Arabia could threaten to start selling oil in currencies other than the dollar, and then the U.S. would have to invade. And you'll notice an interesting correlation between countries that express an interest in selling energy in currencies other than the U.S. dollar and them getting invaded. There's
Egypt.
Egypt, Libya, Venezuela. They either get their economy destroyed, or a civil war seems to spontaneously break out, or any number of disasters might, excuse me, might just mysteriously befall them if they express an interest in selling in, the yuan, the Chinese currency, or something other than the U.S. dollar. But, getting back to Saudi Arabia and their relationship with Iran, Iran has been funding the various Shia revolutionary movements like the one in Yemen right now. And Saudi Arabia has been fighting a proxy war with Iran in Yemen for number of months now, and it really seems to be kind of a stalemate. Tens of thousands of people are dead. The rebels were winning until Saudi Arabia actually sent their troops across the border, and now it's just seems to be going back and forth. And Saudi Arabia is increasingly afraid, it seems, of Iran's maneuvering, because they're funding some of the Shia rebel groups in Syria. They're funding the Kurds, who have been kicking ISIS's ass. If you've been following this story, they've been funding Hezbollah, who is also fighting ISIS. Hezbollah is fighting Israel simultaneously, so that brings Israel into the mix.
Mm-hmm.
And then the Kurds have also been fighting against the Turkish government, because the Kurdish homeland consists of parts of Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and Syria. And the Turkish government has been fighting aggressively back against the Kurds, and Turkey and Saudi Arabia seem to have formed an alliance with each other against the Syrian government. And they've conducted this massive operation inviting dozens of other countries in Saudi Arabia called Operation Northern Thunder. You saw this?
Right.
And there's a lot of numbers being thrown around there, but the operation conducted in northern Saudi Arabia had anywhere from 150 to 350,000 troops there.
And these are just this is what countries call war games or tactical training operations, and these events randomly seem to occur before major military campaigns. So this is one of those hard facts that you just can't ignore, and this is very recently occurring. So it's going to be quite interesting to see what happens, because we haven't seen all of these countries. I know the Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Jordan, Bahrain, Kuwait, Pakistan, even Qatar, Tunisia. All these countries are getting involved in this, and what do you think the outcome is going to be? What do you think we can expect to see in the next couple of months?
Well, Saudi Arabia, it's interesting you mentioned Pakistan just now. It's well known Pakistan has nuclear weapons, and there was an interview with a Saudi political analyst on RT, which looks like an Arabic version of the RT network, which is Russian news network, and they were interviewing him, and he said that the purpose of these exercises is to invade and stop Assad, ostensibly for the purpose of stopping him from killing thousands of innocent Sunni civilians.
Right.
I think this is more an attempt to prevent this Shia axis from forming from Iran to the Mediterranean, because that would sever the link between Turkey and Saudi Arabia, and it would make the Gulf states geographically isolated from the rest of the Sunni world.
And what's dangerous also is that Syria is seemingly surrounded at this point, but they have an ace in their back pocket, which is the connection with Russia.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Russia's been providing air support for the Syrian government, and honestly, I think if had it not been for Russian intervention, they would have already invaded.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the Russian foreign minister said that if they do this, if Saudi Arabia sends its troops across the border, this will effectively start a third world war. So
Right.
that seems to have spooked them. They don't want to provoke a war with Russia because they know that it's not going to end well for them.
Right.
Even though on that RT interview I just mentioned, the Saudi Arabia claims that they are in possession of a nuclear bomb. And they claim that all the superpowers know about this. That's what they're claiming. But, if that's true, doesn't that show what bullshit on top of bullshit this whole invasion of Iraq was back in 2003.
Right.
To prevent nuclear proliferation, when here is a so-called ally of the U.S., which we know is at least indirectly, if not directly, involved with funding terrorist groups and spreading this Wahhabist ideology. This government apparently has a nuclear weapon, and the U.S. is okay with that. But it seems that this story, which broke 2 weeks ago, has not come to pass yet. They have not sent their troops across the border because a truce has been negotiated. Did you see this?
Yeah, this was just a couple days ago, right?
Yeah, and so far it seems to be holding. It's held for about 2 days now. And
do you think that was a strategic move that basically, was saying, all right, hold on, do we really want to do this? Because that once you go forward, there's no going back.
Yeah, that's the thing. Like if they sent the troops across the border into Syria, it would be irreversible. There's no going back from that. The momentum would build into a colossal conflict, and you could only speculate how that would end and how many people would be killed. So no one, it seemed, was prepared to do that. And there were talks led for a while between the U.S. and Russia, leading the talks between both sides, and they seem to have agreed on a ceasefire in Syria. So the government is no longer fighting the rebels, and the rebels are no longer fighting the government. The terrorist groups, or the factions which have been designated terrorist groups by the UN, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda, they were not part of the talks, obviously, so in theory, they're still allowed to attack them. But we don't know if that's still going on at the moment. It seems like ISIS has lost a lot of their momentum since all these other parties started getting involved, whether it's Iran or Russia or what have you. But that's where we stand right now with Syria.
It's eerily similar to pre-World War I. The world situation that we're in right now with these bizarre entangling alliances between countries, and I really hope that this doesn't result in some sort of major conflict, because if this Operation Northern Thunder goes through as they are planning, involvement with Russia will definitely happen next, and then the U.S. will need to flex their muscles, and who knows what could happen. But oftentimes I think about George Washington's words in his farewell address, where not only did he warn against political parties, but he mentioned entangling foreign alliances as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, if there's one speech that was ignored by every fucking presidential candidate over the past 50, 60 years, it would be George Washington's farewell address.
Yeah, it's hard to think of a more interventionist country than the United States right now. They've just gone in completely the opposite direction. And that started pretty much with World War I, and it's continued since then. But well, a little earlier than that, Spanish-American War, but that brings us to today, 110 years later, and we're involved indirectly not only in these issues in the Middle East, but probably directly involved with what's going on in the South China Sea.
Right.
And that leads us into the third theater where this is all going on, with China's military buildup in these islands in the South China Sea.
And a lot of them are, and correct me if I'm wrong, they're partially man-made over different coral reefs and such.
Yeah, they were just dumping thousands and thousands of tons of sand on these coral reefs and building these artificial islands in the middle of the South China Sea. And they've actually They said these were scientific stations to observe weather patterns or whatever. Yeah, okay. But
Yeah, just like HARP is doing the same thing in
yeah,
North America.
exactly. But um, they've taken satellite photos, and you see the Chinese building airstrips on these islands, and constructing harbors within them that are large enough for like battleships to park in or anchor in
Wow.
and whatnot. And what makes this important is that the South China Sea is one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. I think more commerce goes through there than the Suez and the Panama canals combined. So this
Wow.
is like you, to a very large extent, you have the world economy by the balls if you control this one patch of water, because of all the manufacturing that comes out of China and out of Vietnam and Indonesia and what have you. It has to get shipped across the Pacific to North America by passing through the South China Sea. And if you can, if you control those islands, you de facto control that area.
And one of the arguments that was made by the U.S. is that China called upon intelligence planes to stop flying over these islands and closer to the Chinese border, and the U.S. basically said, like, we're not accepting the fact that these are actually your territory because they're man-made. Like,
Yeah.
that's like calling a ship on the ocean Chinese territory, and we can't fly over it.
Yeah, in a way, it's kind of like if you built an oil platform somewhere and then
Exactly.
called that, this is part of the state of such and such, even though it's 500 miles off the coast.
Right.
But yeah, the Defense Secretary Ash Carter insisted that the U.S. does not recognize these as a legitimate territorial claim because they're not natural structures; they're man-made islands that you just built in the middle of nowhere and decided that they weren't belong to you.
Hmm.
If you're the Chinese, um, the Chinese claim that this is all part of a larger smear campaign against people trying to discredit China and what have you, and they've warned planes to turn around, American planes to turn around. They've warned ships to move away from that area, and the U.S. insists that they will send their ships wherever they want. Again, they do not respect these claims. The neighboring countries like the Philippines seem to be looking to the U.S. for help because they're alarmed by how assertive China is becoming in this area, and there's a long sort of history of animosity between China and the U.S. despite all the trade that goes on
Right.
between the two. You have the U.S. selling weapons to Taiwan, which China does not recognize Taiwan's independence. They consider it a renegade province. That's been an issue with them for a long time. They do not like all the U.S. troops in South Korea and in Japan. They see this as a form of encirclement, similar to like what NATO does in Eastern Europe with Russia.
Right.
But this whole region is a powder keg right now because in theory, one naval misunderstanding near one of these islands could spark a naval conflict.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Uh, another word that comes to mind from the Cold War era is MAD, M-A-D, which is mutually assured destruction.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the result. That was basically what all the experts were saying during the Cold War, is that we can build up all these nuclear arms and whatnot, but the result will be the second that one country launches one, the enemy country will launch theirs, and we're just going to end up destroying the entire planet. So I think that's even more relevant today, given the fact that there's, hundreds of countries that are allied with nuclear powers, and again, you have these entangling alliances, and who knows who will push the red button to launch first. But I hope it doesn't happen at all.
I don't think that's anyone's game plan. I think that's kind of the card they keep in their back pocket that they don't want to play unless it's the worst case scenario. But the United States obviously perceives this as a threat, and if you have been looking at announcements by the military or documents they release in the news, the Pentagon strategy has been emphasizing a Pacific shift in their resources and their spending. They want to concentrate more of their energy and focus in the Pacific Ocean rather than in the Middle East. You see, the world is divided up into these regions with the military called geographic combatant commands. And for the last 15 years, U.S. Central Command, which is the Middle East and Central Asia, has been getting the lion's shares of attention. But now more of the funding is being diverted to PACOM, which is Pacific Command. And a lot of that is being spent in the Navy and Air Force. There are troops being sent to Australia and whatnot. So, yeah, there's definitely a lot of posturing going on there. And I think what's really interesting is that this sort of one-upmanship and pre-conflict isn't solely relegated to the military realm. There's an economic aspect to this as well. Like, you've heard of the TPP, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, a lot of people just seem to think that this is, corporate greed run amok. It's like NAFTA on steroids.
Right.
And that this is, just about, outsourcing and exploitation and everything. And yeah, to a certain extent, that's true. But I look at the TPP within the context of this, conflict between this rivalry for supremacy in the Pacific between the United States and China. And this to me looks like a geopolitical maneuver disguised as an economic treaty, a free trade maneuver. Because if you look at all these countries that are included in the TPP, it's a ton of countries. It's like Japan, Chile, South Korea, New Zealand, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Taiwan. Again, Taiwan is not recognized as a country by the Chinese, but they're included in this treaty. All of these countries are included, but who is not included? China.
Right.
Who else is not included? Russia, India, Brazil, South Africa. These are called the BRICS nations. And these are ones that challenged U.S. policies routinely at meetings with the World Trade Organization and things like that. And these are countries that seem to be working together to create a new economic order where it would, in theory, down the road, challenge the U.S. dollar hegemony. Like, it seems the fear of the U.S. government is that these countries could start selling oil and natural gas using the yuan, the Chinese currency, rather than the dollar, and that this would fundamentally threaten America's economic supremacy, so that these treaties like the Trans-Pacific Partnership are a way of isolating these countries that don't want to, that have challenged the U.S. economic world order.
Right.
And if you look at how this treaty fits in with the other ones, WikiLeaks did a great video about this, where it outlines the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, the TTIP, and then one aimed towards South America called TISA. And these three treaties, if you make a Venn diagram, all overlap, and in the intersection of all three circles you have the USA, which is the center of gravity, pulling all these countries away from the BRICS countries. So that it seems like they're attempting to isolate them and punish them for trying to, challenge the petrodollar world order.
Right. So there's a pretty strong argument that this all boils down to essentially U.S. greed and even more so just corporate greed.
Well, it seems like the deep state elite seem to view power exercised by U.S. corporations as an extension of U.S. government power.
Hmm.
They see it as being two sides of the same coin. They don't see a need to distinguish between the two. So if, say, ExxonMobil is pushing around a country that attempts to pass an environmental law that hurts their profits, that's no matter to them. They see that as them acting on behalf of American interests by doing that, because it just maybe they're aware of the negative consequences of doing that, possible environmental problems, dangerous legal precedents. But in the grand scheme of things, the U.S. retains its status as the world superpower by doing that, by allowing this to happen.
What I've often thought about is if there was a potential conflict with China and the U.S., how would a company like Apple respond, and what happens to the manufacturing facilities in China that are basically being used for cheap U.S. labor? Like, how would that even work? What's the next step if there's all of a sudden a conflict between China and the U.S.? How does Apple recover from something like that?
Well, it seems that these treaties are setting up the framework for other options to relocate manufacturing if that happens.
Right.
Because if China and the U.S. go to war, that Apple can't make their phones in China anymore, because that would be aiding
the enemy.
trading with the enemy. Which is explicitly illegal. But if you look at who's included in the treaty instead of China, you have Vietnam, you have Taiwan, you have other developing countries with cheap labor costs. U.S. corporations could just move their manufacturing there pretty seamlessly, and then they would effectively cut China out of the world economy if they had to by doing that.
Wow.
So yeah, it's again this is sort of like an invisible empire that's being built there. It's hiding in plain sight. You don't see it, but its influence is felt everywhere, and it is a new economic world order, buttressed by a political order, which is the visible part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's the iceberg analogy. That 80% of an iceberg is hidden underneath the surface of the water. All these parallel legal systems where corporations can sue sovereign governments behind the scenes and everything. That's the invisible part of it. So if China were to theoretically try to pull Vietnam into its orbit, the other countries and the corporations within those countries could punish the Vietnamese government and sue them, and for billions of dollars, and they'd have to pay. So it's kind of like joining a gang. Once you get in, you can't get out. Or you have to go through a beatdown before they let you out.
That's a good analogy. Wow. So this is some really intense stuff, and I hope that these three scenarios do not become reality. But unfortunately, as history has shown, we're about due for another epic world war. And fuck, I don't even know. I don't even know what to say. I hope that the U.S. does not become involved, even though that would be inevitable.
I think that if you look at these three theaters we've described, where something is most likely to be triggered is the Middle Eastern one.
I would agree with that.
That's the most unstable region of the world as a whole, excluding maybe parts of Africa. You have these borderline failed states like Syria engaged in massive civil wars, which they've just recently brought to a halt. Maybe they can keep that going. I hope they can.
Right.
But you have all these countries jockeying for position that hate each other. You have the religious aspect of it, which the Sunnis and the Shias fighting each other. You have these smaller factions, the Kurds and the Alawites and what have you. And then you have these full-blown terrorist groups like ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra making things even more complicated. Yeah, I think it was Ash Carter again who described this as three-dimensional chess. It's just mind-bogglingly complicated, and one thing could spark a chain reaction that causes the whole thing to explode. So the other two regions, I think there seem to be more rational actors there. But this in the Middle East is the biggest powder keg, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And we can negotiate with the Chinese. There is no negotiating with our illegitimate child, ISIS, at this point, if you know what I mean. So I think that there's better business connections and diplomatic connections between Asia and the U.S. than there is in the Middle East.
Yeah. I would say that arguably the linchpin of this whole thing, where you want to really keep your eye on for the next couple years, is Turkey and Saudi Arabia to a lesser extent, because Turkey is a NATO member. They shot down a Russian jet a few months ago.
Yeah.
You all remember that. Under the NATO treaty, if one NATO country is attacked, all the other countries are obligated to come to their aid. So there's the entangling alliance aspect.
Mm-hmm.
Turkey's president, or Turkey, knows that oil companies, which have links to the Turkish government, are the ones buying the oil from ISIS. You've heard on the news, ISIS makes $1 million a day selling oil on the black market.
Right.
Well, that begs the question, who's buying it from them? It's Turkish oil companies. So Turkey, a member of NATO, is the one funding ISIS. And that's not including whatever other funding they may or may not be getting from the CIA or whoever, depending on who you believe. So that is a region of the world to really keep your eye on over the next couple years. And if the current president, Erdogan, is removed from power there, it could definitely calm things down a bit, because he is definitely an instigator. He's publicly stated he wants Assad gone in Syria, and he's been very hostile to Russia, which has been sending air support into the region. And I really think that's kind of the linchpin for this whole thing.
Wow, that's really all I can say. I mean,
yeah, it's
we're talking about literally World War III here, and it's a very depressing topic. Where do we go from here? I mean, what can the U.S. do? How can regular citizens who are not plugged into the matrix attempt to prevent something like this from happening? What can we do?
I don't know about prevent something like this from happening. I would say just keep your finger on the pulse here. Stay alert of what's happening in the news from a geopolitical standpoint. Don't get so caught up in the partisan thing like Republican, Democrat aspect of things, but look at how general trends of how countries behave, like whether or not the same agenda is being pursued regardless of which party is nominally in power, because that's pretty much what happened if you look at George W. Bush to Obama. So be mindful of like what's happening on the world stage, and to the best of your ability, vote for politicians that would not instigate things further, and just save up money and have a backup plan for somewhere to relocate. I would not, I'll tell you right now, I would not be visiting certain regions of the world until I see drastic evidence that this is cooling down. I've been to Istanbul before. I would not go back there again until this calms down. There's terrorist attacks left and right in Turkey right now. And then you have the migrant crisis going on in Europe. Again, ISIS could be infiltrating those groups of migrants. You have to kind of just, be mindful of what's going on, but don't let it freak you out.
Right.
There's no use stressing over stuff you can't control. I don't know beyond starting change.org petitions to the government, you could say, to prevent a conflict from happening. You just got to be alert.
Right. And something that we've always promoted here is to have a fuck you fund and an emergency fund. So have enough money in your account or out of an account, preferably, to get out of the immediate area that you live in, and preferably get to a border, either Canada or Mexico. So those are things that we always promote here on the False Flag Nation, but I think they're becoming even more relevant ideas as we see the potential for a future world war.
Yeah, and well, maybe none of that will matter if Donald Trump becomes president and puts everyone in a chokehold and sends Secretary of State Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson over to negotiate peace in the Middle East. I think he'd just grab the Caliph in Raqqa and just deliver a nice rock bottom and a people's elbow to him, and I think we'd settle this thing in an afternoon.
Yeah, we have to go over the in another episode how what the U.S. government would look like and who Trump would appoint to various positions. I think that would be a hilarious episode.
That would be very funny.
I could see Howard Stern being the chairman of the FCC if Donald Trump was if Donald Trump was elected.
I would be okay with that.
Me too.
I'd be okay with him running the FCC.
Me too.
And we can compare that with what might happen if Hillary or Bernie wins too. That's a good idea. We're going to do that for sure.
That's good. But I think we're out at time right now, so why don't we wrap this up?
Exactly. We're just about at an hour here. That's all for this week. This is an evolving topic. We will be revisiting it again and in more detail. And just again, keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on here. Tune in to us on iTunes and subscribe. That helps you because you get our new episodes automatically. It helps us because it makes our ratings go up. Follow us on Twitter at False Flag Nation. We're also on Facebook. And visit our main website at www.falseflagnation.com for show notes and more. That is all for this week. This is Joe DeMarco signing off.
William Revere signing off.
All right, thanks a lot, folks. We'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in.